Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Bertie. Probably only most popular because I probably volunteer more than anybody else. So just purely numbers. From a packed room in London here, it's great to see some real people in the room. And good afternoon to everyone online. This is the second time I've presented this today. It's bound to be entirely different from the first time I presented it because I'm standing up here rather than sitting in my home office staring at my screen. So it's very, very good really to sort of be back in the room and to relearn how to do this. You really don't need me to tell you what's been going on for the last couple of years, at least I hope you don't. I'd rather be presenting under sort of better kind of global circumstances than we are today. But what I'm going to try and do today is give you an alternative perspective. All we see really from our interactions with clients, from conversations I have, is everybody wants to know what to do next and how we're going to do it. There's a real thirst at the moment for solutions. So I've tried to position a solution here which is a little different from other solutions that you might have heard about, you might read about, or that you might just think sort of just instinctively from your time in the business that is the right way to do things. Sorry, my laptop has just gone off, so I'm going to have to look at the screen here. But realistically, what we're not going to do today is we're not going to sort of get bogged down in how many days we think we ought to be back in the office. We're not going to get bogged down either in whether this is just the sort of continuation or acceleration of trends that were in existence pre-COVID, or whether this is a revolution of any sort. This is actually looking at our life in terms of it being a whole system problem. Because I think for the first time in the 30 years that I've been in this business, we're actually not just looking at the workplace itself, but we're looking at everything societally that sits around it. So we're looking at where we live. A lot of stories about people sort of moving out of urban environments, moving to the suburbs, moving to the countryside. How we shop, how we buy things, how we source things, how we're entertained, how we relax. What we actually do in our social lives, and all of the transport and all of the sort of movement effectively from one place to another. The workplace is very much part of this whole system. But unlike crises I think we've faced in the past, for the first time ever, we're actually looking at this as a whole system problem. So what I'm going to propose as well is a solution that I believe fits into that whole system and can actually help to address some of the problems we're encountering and facing in some of the other areas within this system. I should say, I think it's actually probably a fantastic time to be in sort of urban planning and town planning and infrastructure planning, probably more so than just looking at the office itself. But I think for most people who are either advising clients, working with clients, or are from a client organization, probably facing something quite similar to this, which is a little bit of a problem we can't seem to get ourselves out of at the moment because we're not achieving critical mass in the workplace. Now, I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by critical mass in a moment. But what's really happening is we're thinking, okay, I've been working at home for a while. I'm going to give it a go. I've got free choice. Most organizations at the moment, from the research that I've read, is sort of more than 90% of organizations are allowing their people to go back into the office whenever they choose. I'm going to go and see what's going on. So in my mind, I have this sort of vision, this picture of what's happening in the office is exactly how it used to be pre-COVID. On the days that I'm choosing to go in, everyone else is going to come in too for my benefits. It's going to be fantastic and I'm going to see all my old friends and it's all going to be buzzing and really kicking. But when I get there, not many people have actually chosen to do the same thing at the same time on the same day as me. So the office feels like a sort of denigrated experience from what we knew it before. And we've probably actually sort of got a little bit of a rose-tinted view of what we knew before as well, because we'll recall the good days we had in the office and the sort of the positive experiences we had, and we'll expect to have some of that too when we get back. But actually what we're finding is it really is a crap experience when we get there. The Sunday Times said a couple of weeks ago that 27% of people, I'm not sure quite how they actually fathomed that figure, but they said about 27% of people in London are now back in their offices for some of the time. Not all of the time, for some of the time. So the overall figure will be less than that. But even at 27%, that's only about half of what we saw pre-COVID. And our memories in this respect are short as well, because actually pre-COVID, we really were only just over half full in most offices, in most city centres for most of the time, on an average basis, peaking at around about 60 to 65% in the main from all of the sorts of utilisation data we used to gather. So we're actually sitting under half of what we used to find. Now, when someone uses the expression critical mass, what critical mass involves is enough fissile material to create a chain reaction, which means we no longer have to intervene. What that actually means is that the attendance in the office is effectively self-sustaining. That chain reaction, the fissile material, human beings in that space, they no longer need to be told to be in the office. They no longer need to be encouraged or any sort of treats dangled in their way. They can actually return to the office under their own steam, and we start to create that chain reaction. But we're not achieving that at the moment. So we're stuck in this sort of loop, and we can't seem to get out of it. So what do we normally do when we're trying to improve our workplace? What do we normally do when we want more people to come into a space? What we're actually hearing a lot of talk of at the moment is doing what we've always done, which is we add more. We add more amenities, more services, more facilities. We add more personalization, more sort of individualization of that space. What we're actually looking at doing at the moment, we think our response is, well, if we need to get people to come back into this office because we think it's good for them, don't have any evidence of that, but we think it's good for people to be in that same physical space together, instinctively believe that to be true for some of the time, then what we need to do is we need to give people more, because obviously they're not coming back with the way it is. So what are we going to do about it from here? Actually, we have to question, really, with levels of utilization just touching above 50%. And if you look at indices like Leesman, levels of satisfaction generally just peaking above 50% as well, we have to question whether that is ever a model that's worked. This whole game of continual one-upmanship, has it ever really produced any results worth talking about, worth the investment? If we really only got just over half our people in the office on a good day, and only just over half of them are actually satisfied with that experience, that's on the basis of all of this stuff and all of these services that we've been adding over the years. So what makes us think post-COVID, when people have got a choice, when we've been through this seismic realization that we can actually effectively and productively work outside of the office, why do we think adding more is going to produce a different result? Because actually, if you think back to sort of what Einstein said, he said that actually the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So we're actually facing a bit of an issue in relation to everything we thought we ever knew about providing a workplace, which is that quite possibly pursuing that same strategy is not going to be successful. So what I'm going to propose to you is that actually we don't do that anymore. Now that is highly counterintuitive from where we're sitting now. And I'm going to explain to you how we sort of effectively rebuild our understanding of the workplace based on providing the minimal viable workplace rather than continually adding features, services to what we already have. So a little bit of theory in terms of how we look at doing that. Because actually, I think what's quite interesting really is that anyone who actually denies that the office really can make a lot of contribution in the future still actually wants a vibrant, pulsing, lively city. They still want the urban environment to be far more alive than it's been. I mean, I've come from the tube station here. The streets are really busy. Cafes seem pretty crowded. Admittedly, this is in a central area. This is right slap bang in the middle of the week in that sort of hump that we're seeing of people coming here. So it's far away from the weekend effectively right now as we can possibly get either way. So consequently, it's likely to be like that. The trains were extremely busy. There is some life. We want to see a vibrant, lively city at the same time as we also recognise that we don't necessarily need to be in an office all the time. So actually, I think the general feeling is that irrespective of sort of online retail opportunities and the opportunities to do things that sort of replicate the functionality of the city, we do still want, within all of this, to see a vibrant urban environment. But let's think about 4 characteristics that, if we're taking a blank piece of paper approach here, which is what I'm suggesting, rather than thinking about what we have now, thinking about how we can tweak it. Let's just look for a minute. If we were starting from scratch, if those cities didn't exist, you saw that image there, they're fading out. Let's suppose there's nothing there at all. And let's build what it is we think we need. There are 4 characteristics, I believe, that all workplaces actually need. So first of all, they have to work. And this is right back to sort of Vitruvius writing in the 1st century AD. We've had over 2,000 years to think about it, still get it wrong. But nevertheless, we want our workplaces to be highly functional. They have to have a purpose. I don't think that purpose is going to be anything other than a combination of interactive and individual work. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that that is changing. Those who are throwing away all of their desks, expecting that everybody's going to understand an entirely interactive workplace, probably needs to make sure they keep them in a lockup somewhere. They're probably going to need them back at some point, because there will still be a balance between individual and group work in a workspace. We have to understand what that is and how we're going to create it and how it's going to work. But fundamentally, a workplace has to work. Otherwise, it's entirely pointless. We have to be able to use it. It's our user interface. So it has to be simple. It has to be intuitive. We don't need a great big explanation of how we're supposed to use a workplace. It should be something that we can just tap straight into. I worked on a project once where there was a page of A4 instructions on how to use a light switch. Consequently, nobody bothered. Why would you? You just want on, off. That's intuitive, that's simple, that's something we can understand. So we have to remember when we're putting all of this together that actually we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, and we don't want to get too complicated with the way we're looking to create this. It then needs to work all of the time, because it's pointless having a fantastic workplace if parts or all of it don't actually work, which means there's a significant role in our workplace for the facilities management teams, for making sure that it's maintained, for making sure that we create the right service infrastructure, service environment, to make sure also that the users of the space, the occupants of the space, feel responsible as well for making sure that it is always working. So they will report faults, and they will be part of that solution loop. And then finally, because we can't forget that we're inspired by what we see that's beautiful, we're inspired aesthetically, the space needs to be beautiful as well. And sometimes beauty in itself can have a utility. Just purely and simply, the beauty of an object can do something for us that none of those other three characteristics can do. So when we think about it, is this really that difficult to start with? When we think about what it is we need, workplace needs to be functional, needs to be usable, reliable and beautiful. But how do we sort of set all of that into a sort of practical solution? What do we do with that next if we're accepting that those four characteristics are everything we need in starting from scratch, in starting with this white piece of paper? So it's lucky, actually, because somebody had already thought of this. The reason I put those up there, and has anyone actually seen this model before? Okay. This is Lean Startup. This was by Eric Ries. It's just over 10 years old. I'm often saying that in our industry, in the workplace industry, we borrow a lot from the IT industry and the software industry. Even things like agile, were terms that were used well before workplace used them, used by the software development industry. It's not to say necessarily that the software development industry actually invents all of these phrases. They've borrowed them from elsewhere. This really came from lean manufacturing in the first place. But what you'll notice here that's really important is we've got a distinction between what it is we need and what it is we want. And we've actually got some proportionality. That green dotted line that goes from the peak to the base means that actually what we're considering is each one of those four characteristics, but we're considering them in proportion, and that proportionality is extremely important. This model is used as the sort of basis for creating a minimum viable product in software terms, which is where we get the expression minimum viable workplace from. Now, what often happened with software before Lean Startup was that all of the focus went into functionality. And instead of looking at that proportionally, what happened was all of the development started at the baseline, and it just all of the effort, all of the time, the money, all of the thinking and the coding and everything all went into creating a functional product without really giving too much time to its reliability, usability, and that whole sort of experience of using it through making it something attractive to use. And so consequently, they failed. So Lean Startup was attempting to address that and attempting to say, look, there are a series of characteristics to create exactly what we need. We have to do that in proportion. Now, in terms of what it is we need rather than what it is we want, at that point that we've created our minimum viable product, our minimum viable workplace, that's the point in time that we get it to the customer. So in terms of software development, what it's all about is an MVP is something that we can actually have customers start to use. That's when we get into our perpetual beta state. Because what happens is, perpetual beta used to be called the banana principle, which is that the product matures with the customer. If you think you buy a green banana from the supermarket and eventually it ripens at home. So that's the idea behind perpetual beta, is that we get it as fast as possible in as workable a format as possible to the customer, in our case, to the occupant of the space. And then we start to listen to the experience of the customer, and we start to have a dialogue, and we start to engage with the customer in what it is they actually want from that space, what's working, what's not working, what needs to change. So it's a continual process. Once the MVP is created, that's really when the fun starts. That's when we start to understand how far we need to move from what it is we need into what we want. And we're actually involved in that continual dialogue with the users of space to establish that over a period of time. So what does the minimum viable workplace actually look like? What are its components? And I think we can address this in terms of looking at sort of two categories really from what it is we know today. First is what it is we'll do less of. Because actually this is really where we've been investing over the years. This is the culture of more that we've actually experienced over the last sort of 20 to 30 years, particularly in the last 10 years up to the point of COVID, and now we're talking about it again. These are generally more sort of tangible contributions within that workplace. And what I'll come on to in terms of doing less of those things that are slightly less tangible. Now, when we look at this if we've got people making a choice as to whether to be there or not, even with a workplace worth going to, we're going to need less space. It's just simple maths. I don't think I've spoken to a client or a potential client in the last 12 months who is actually thinking of adding to their space, and I would be very surprised if any of you have, outside of mergers or acquisitions or substantial changes in the nature of the way the business is going to operate. But steady state organizations, as far as we can call any organization steady-ish state, they're actually looking at space reduction. But it's about having the right space rather than just less space. Interestingly, when I've done some sort of property searches in London, I haven't seen a lot of sort of the manifestation really of the shedding of space. There seems to be a lot of talk about reducing space at the moment, but in reality, it doesn't seem to be happening at any kind of pace. But if we think very carefully about the way that our workplace sits in its host community and its host environment, what's been happening over the last few decades is we've been adding these more and more services and amenities into the workplace. But what we're actually doing is we're locking out the host community in doing so. So if we put a gym in our office, then we're not going to go and use the local gym that's 3 streets away, that's 3 minutes walk away. And actually gives people a break from being in the office where they can actually go and work out away from their colleagues rather than having to work out in front of their colleagues. So what we're actually doing is by putting our workplaces in the middle of urban environments and then providing more and more amenities and services, we're actually depriving the host community of business. Actually, if we were to draw a circle around this particular location here, and we were to look at all of the amenities and services within probably about 100 meters of this office, I think we'll be stunned at what access we had to services and amenities in this locality. Now, there are obviously some services and amenities that are valuable. The ability to just sort of pause, to get coffee, to talk to colleagues. Yes, we've proven that over the years. That's extremely important. But we don't necessarily need to be providing breakfast, lunch and dinner for everyone in the office. There are other opportunities to get people out of that space as much as spend time within it. And the host community needs to survive and it needs to thrive. So if we're bringing people into those city centres and we're putting them in those workplaces, we need to give them the opportunity to actually integrate with that local community. What I actually saw in Australia shortly before the last lockdown that I was really encouraged by was a lot of buildings in city centres now actually have public domain space on the ground floor, sometimes even on the first floor of buildings. So you're not locked out of that building in that urban environment. You can walk right through it. You can use all of the amenities and services that are provided within that physical building. But it's always been a little bit of a problem to me that we create fantastic workplaces, we build them in our city centres, then we stick the access gates on, we put security guards on, and you can't come in. So much more physical integration with our local environment. But when we think about availability, who now, outside of 24/7 contact centres, needs continual availability day and night to their workplace? We've proven completely that we don't need to be in a workplace at all. So why would we actually need to have our workplaces operating 24/7 unless there are people actually needing to be there because we've got some kind of follow the sun operation in that space. So there are a couple of angles to this. One is, if we're not actually heating and lighting these places, we're actually making a positive environmental contribution. The other angle is there's a lot of groups in that host community, a lot of services operating in that local community that need space. And we're sitting on a whole pile of it that we don't need to occupy all of that time. If we think about a 50% occupied commercial building, and we think about the I think it's 168 hours that it's potentially available during the week, we're probably occupying that at less than 15% of its available time. Now, from a sustainability point of view, that is nothing short of terrible. If we actually then think that we're only operating at a maximum of 27%, we're in single digits in terms of the time we're actually beneficially using that physical space. And then look at the amount of physical space commercially in every city centre around the world. And imagine that extrapolated across the world. That is a huge amount of real estate that is emitting CO2, that is consuming energy that doesn't need to be. So how can we actually engage with our host community in terms of offering that space when we're not using it so that it's beneficial to those local groups? And finally, in terms of uniqueness, branding a space, making that space our own, giving it our sort of organization's identity. Most organizations will say, we need to make it feel like our space when people come in, when our visitors come in. It's got to be ours. Well, why does it have to feel like that? We know who we work for. Visitors know who they're coming to see. Realistically, do we have to go to that extent? If you think about the amount of embodied carbon in the branding in a workplace to make it different, to make it unique, actually, we have a very serious problem when we think about it in terms of the differentiation that we pursue when we're creating a workplace. So actually, do we need to do as much of that if we're creating a minimum viable workplace? I would argue that if you could actually create 2, 3, 4 points on every sort of key building, key workplace where you could actually create some identity for the occupant organization, and you really don't need to do much more than that. And if you were to leave one day and another organization would come in, you don't have to strip it all out and start again. Sorry, Mark. So there are some real issues, I think, here with our pursuit of uniqueness that need to be addressed. What do we need to do more of? Well, the first thing is we need to explain to the occupants of the space why we're doing this. We actually need to engage with our colleagues in relation to raising their awareness of the issues we're facing, why this is a whole system problem, why we're taking this approach, why we're looking at this from a sort of bottom-up process, a white piece of paper, a standing start, effectively. Why are we taking this route at all? Why is this even important? Why don't we just give free lunch, free coffee, free gym membership, more yoga classes, free apples? Let's just keep going with adding more and more and adding more and more incentive to come back. Actually, instead of trying to explain to people what activity-based working means, we have to actually start to talk to people about why we're doing what we're doing, why we're behaving responsibly, why we're actually trying to help not just our organization, but we're trying to help the community in which it resides, and we're trying to help the planet as well. That integration is fundamental to the minimum viable workplace, because if we're stripping it down, if we're actually providing less, providing it to a high quality, doing it extremely well, but there's less in there, then we have to be really proactive in integrating with that community. Whether that's for the access we're granting it, whether that's for the services that the local community is providing, but we have to be out there. We have to be talking to people, not just landing, not just shutting the doors, putting the security across it and pretending it doesn't exist, or seeing the location of that workplace as literally just a convenient spot to get people to and from the tube station, but actually integrating with our local community. We have to make sure that that workplace remains relevant and remains appropriate to the organization over time. Our organizations are in perpetual beta. They are never finished. An organization is in constant state of adaptation and evolution. And so therefore the workplace that supports it has to be that way as well. It can't just be something that is built, has to last 10 years, and we just watch it declining in relevance over that 10 years as it all starts to fall to bits. That's not the way that this is going to work in the future. We have to make sure that we are able to adapt that workplace to stay in step with the organization and it's in step as well with changes in society, because we have certainly seen some of those in the last couple of years, and there's no saying that we're not going to see a lot more of those again in the near future. So the ability to be adaptable is essential, which means our access to capital to complete that work, to continually evolve that space as we go. I think it changes the nature of the fit-out model within our industry. I think it becomes a longer-term relationship, smaller pieces of work. Again, sounds very much like the way that software development evolved, from large-scale sequential projects where the purpose was defined, then the systems analyst was done, then the coding was done, then the rollout was done, and they all failed. That's why the agile software development methodology was brought into being, because it was very small pieces of work, regularly appraised, welcoming change rather than fearing change, so embodying change in everything it did, having that active dialogue, and being prepared to admit that a piece of work didn't work, go back, fix it again, but we're not trying to reinvent the whole thing every single time. So that approach to software development is what I'm proposing we need to take when it comes to physical space as well. Being prepared to do small pieces of work, regularly reappraise them, constant dialogue with the occupants of that space to make sure that it remains appropriate and it remains functional for all of those people in it. And the commonality really relates to the way we share that space. If we've got less space and people are using it on a more dynamic basis, then some of the ideas that have resurfaced recently, we've just started to see the re-emergence of the open plan bashing that we saw pre-COVID. It's alive and well. It's just been hibernating for the last couple of years, but some of the same correspondents have already taken to their keyboards, and we're still starting to see that open plan is the devil's work. It's the worst idea ever. Well, actually, we've taken on the whole idea of collaborative consumption, of sort of usage rather than ownership in so many areas of our life. We'll come into a workplace and we'll talk about the Airbnb we stayed in, or the Uber we got last night home after the event. These are all organizations who don't own real estate, they don't own taxis. This whole sort of world that's been invented really for us in the last 10 years of just usage rather than ownership. But I have to have my own desk when I come into the office. Or actually, even better, I'd like my own office, because you lot might all have COVID and I want to be in a safe, secure bubble when I come into that office. So it's almost like the last frontier at times. And what we're starting to see is an understandable response in relation to health, which is, I need more personal space. I need that to be my own space. I don't want anyone using my keyboard, anyone using my mouse, even though this is an airborne virus. I just want to make sure that it's mine. Well, actually, everything else that's going on around us is all driving towards sharing. It's the use of scarce resources in a responsible manner, and we have to do the same thing in a workplace. We just have to find the best ways to do it. There is no such thing as there's no real sort of sense that open plan is necessarily a bad thing. But there is such a thing as bad open plan, just as there is bad office design in every other generic category of office design. There's good and bad design in everything. So yes, there are some pretty lousy open plan schemes out there, but there are also some extremely good ones. It's just making sure that we understand how to make the most of that commonality. And back to awareness, for people to understand why we're actually doing this. What's the purpose of this? Why are we actually behaving in this responsible manner? Responsible to ourselves, our people, our host communities, and the planet. And the last suggestion here is that we replace this drive towards uniqueness instead with a pride in what we're doing. A pride in trying to be responsible, to try and behave responsibly, to try and take a different view of our workplace, of the provision of the workplace, to make sure that we're not just gratuitously providing amenities and services and just continually adding more to that workplace, hoping that it's going to be successful in bringing people back. It's not about all of the glitz and glamour we put into that space to make it unique. It's about taking pride in having arrived at a minimum viable workplace and taking pride in the fact that we have this ongoing dialogue, and that dialogue is productive and that workplace stays relevant to the organization over time. So, time for some pros and cons. This has to be a balanced consideration. It's not all upside, but I'm going to talk about the upside first. If we think about a sort of a tool for analysis, I think the triple bottom line is an excellent way to look at this, looking at the needs of people, the organization, and the planet. The difficulty with most of the decisions we'll take when we think about the triple bottom line is usually addressing one of those areas can often have a negative impact on one or more of the others. So if you focus too much on people, like take for instance, just giving everyone choice. Here's our workplace. It's exactly what we left behind before COVID. So come in whenever you want. And we're getting sort of sub 20% utilization of that space. We've given people choice. We've focused on people. We've made sure that people are free to come and go as they wish. But it's costing the organization a lot of money, and it's having a negative impact on the planet. We need to release that space. We need to repurpose that space. We can't just have it sitting there empty all day, every day, because we're focusing on people. So we can see how pushing one side of the triple bottom line actually negatively impacts the others. But if we think about it in terms of the sort of environments we can create, I actually think the minimum viable workplace can sit very neatly inside that triangle and can actually benefit people, the organization, and the planet simultaneously. You know, we can create a compelling environment to people that is a compelling environment for everyone. I think inclusivity now is right at the top of that list of considerations when we're designing space in detail. We can make it, as I suggested earlier, very intuitive, very easy to use, simple, immediately accessible, and we can be very clear on the purpose of that space and why we might want to bring people into it, how it works. For the organisation, I've really sort of stressed the need for the space to be adaptive, to evolve with the organisation, and whether we like it or not, you know, in this current climate, or really in any climate, it needs to be commercially responsible. We need to make sure the organisation can control its costs. It might not be anywhere near the cost of the people within an organisation, but nevertheless, it is a significant cost. And in aligning the brand, it's still quite possible to do that. I'm not suggesting that we de-brand our workplaces. I'm suggesting that we brand them responsibly, but that actually more important than the branding of the workplace is the pride we take in behaving responsibly and creating something responsible. And then in terms of that responsibility with the planet, it's going to get us a long way towards our net zero targets, because we're looking at only the space we need, only the amenities and the services we need. So we have this sort of idea and this culture of sufficiency around all of that. And we are incredibly well connected with our host community in every possible sense. So I think there's every possibility that the minimum viable workplace can satisfy all three of the pillars, if you like, of the triple bottom line. But, you know, there are likely to be some problems. There are likely to be some issues associated with getting there. I think the first one of those really is the skepticism that will result. I feel a little bit at the moment like a lone voice. I've had some really good sort of comments. I wrote a post about this a few weeks ago. I've talked about it a couple of times. It is starting to resonate, but I'm not seeing anybody else sort of openly advocating this at the moment. That's not to say it might happen. If in a few months' time I'm still not finding anybody advocating, I might have to seriously question whether I was along the right lines or not. But I still think there is a lot of skepticism out there about changing the entire focus of an industry in a very short space of time. Because let's face it, what we're actually proposing here is doing things incredibly differently from the way that it's being done at the moment, and also changing a lot of minds in terms of the way they think about it at the moment. So I'm fully expecting there to be a lot of skeptical faces and a lot of skeptical views out there in relation to this at the moment. And we do have a lot of existing commitments. We've got leases, we've got sort of legal aspects of the portfolio that we've created. We do have to understand, once we've created this on a sort of blank piece of paper, how we migrate, how we move from where we are today to where we think we need to get to, then becomes quite a challenge, not just in terms of the commitments, but the practicality of that means it's a heck of a lot of work for people to do. So we have to have the right people doing that, and we have to have a commitment to do that work and to invest that time in creating it. I talked about the need for awareness, to create the awareness amongst the occupants of the space. I'd like to think that we could move that from awareness to some degree of enlightenment, for people to actually instinctively understand that this is the right way to do it. Not just to have to think about it, to write a list of pros and cons, but just to believe that this is the responsible and the right way to create a workplace and to sustain a workplace over time. So I've attempted a bit of a definition I didn't put this up at the front. I wanted to explain where I was going with it. I think there are three essential parts of this definition. The first, really, that it's got to enable effective and efficient individual and group work. We're not talking about a workplace being for collaboration or interaction only. There is still going to be a balance of activity within that space. And it's only that we need to provide. I think the second part of it is looking at balancing those three needs, people, the organisation and the planet. And within the planet, I include the sort of host community of that workplace as well. So we need to make sure that all the decisions we're taking are actually evaluated against that triple bottom line. And then we have to think about it really being the most adaptable, the most evolving space that we can possibly create. Because we're not talking about this just literally moving from where we are today to where we want to get to as a one-time activity. This is a living, breathing prospect. This is where this is going, for the foreseeable future. I'm not just suggesting that we take what we have today and we change it and we walk away and think the job is done. The moment that we actually start changing things, that really is just the beginning. And then beyond that, that's the most we do. No more than that. So overall, in summary, I do think we can have it all by having less. I think it's going to be quite a challenge. I think it's going to be a lot of hard work. I think we need, in some senses, to start a movement. If that's something that we think is worthwhile pursuing. I do think we are facing some emergencies, like the climate emergency, like the challenge that's being faced by our cities within that. This isn't just, shall we do something with our workplace? As I said at the beginning, this is a whole system problem and it needs a whole system solution. And I think the minimum viable workplace can be part of that whole system solution. Because from here on in, it's not just about us, it's about all of us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. I've got a few questions for you. I'm going to do 2 questions here, and then I will switch over to Mark and let him ask you any questions from the audience. So the first question I have is from Andrew Jacobs. He asks, how does user motivation fit into lean startup? It feels as if the requirements are the producer's limits, but not the users.
That's a very good question. I'm just processing it. I think it's both the producer and the user, to use those expressions. I think the earliest possible dialogue in creating the vision of the minimum viable workplace is essential. I think it's not just a sort of production and then a dialogue. I think that dialogue is essential. Pulling that team together that will look at this in the first place, in the first instance, is incredibly important. That's not just something that's done in a very small corner of the organisation. That's something where the right people have to be in the room to start considering it. And I think actually, because there is this responsible aim, and I do like to think that most people at least have a sort of, a responsible thread within them that they are happy to pursue. I think because we're saying this is all about a responsible solution, I think we're going to get a lot of enthusiasm for being part of that. And I think we're going to start that dialogue very early.
Fantastic. I got one more. James Dean asks, where would you put a healthy environment in your characteristics, or is this separate?
This is a healthy environment. I mean, there's no question of it. Health is sort of very high on our agenda now, and should always have been. It's interesting, actually. We've almost dispensed with health and safety, which is seen as a sort of almost statutory compliant type of part of facilities management, in favour of well-being, which is a much more sort of cool expression and involves a lot more sort of, interesting aspects. But I think what's happened during COVID is we've sort of re-established the importance of health and safety in our thinking. Health and safety isn't just about labelling the substances that the cleaners use, and doing a manual handling assessment or a display screen assessment. Health and safety really underpins well-being. It's the core part of an approach to well-being. So in that sense, it will be a core part of designing a minimum viable workplace. I'm not sure where to look. I'm looking at everyone in the room.
No, that's good. That's good.
I'm not sure exactly.
Any questions at all in the room from anyone? Could you take the microphone so that people online can hear? Thanks. Yeah, Neil, I just wondered about the the idea of the minimum viable workplace in terms of the sort of bandwidth in terms of time that is the minimum viable workplace a question of being very much of the moment as people return to work, or is this a way that we should look at workplace, in the future and moving forward? Just wondered how you see that.
As we have a climate emergency, as we have an emergency in our urban environments where people are not coming back into the city in the way that they used to, or coming back into those urban environments. And I also think, interestingly, with that challenge, I'm not really sensing, and this is completely anecdotal, but I'm not really sensing that there's been a displacement from our city centres in terms of that activity, in terms of that spending power to the suburbs, to sort of more local environments. I think what's happening is when we work at home, we stay at home. Because we come into a workplace as we might, as where we're sitting now, we have certain needs that need to be satisfied during the day. So we'll go out into that urban infrastructure and we'll pursue those. We're not really doing that at home because we've got everything we need around us and we've got the solution to those needs around us. So actually, there's probably, I would suspect, overall a drop in demand in our sort of urban environment overall. And there's a need that's not being satisfied at the moment. So I think we have two emergencies in my mind that need us to start working on this straight away. And I think once we get in step with this and once we start to understand how to do this, I think this is what we will continue to do. This is what I hope we will continue to do, because I don't think the climate emergency is going away any year now. I think it's just going to get worse. And I think the long-term effect on our urban environments isn't really understood yet. I think we're only really just starting to understand what that means for our cities, for our towns. So I think we start now.
Any other questions in the room?
Neil, thank you. Just one thing occurs to me. I think quite a lot of the problem is about people not returning is to do with commuting and living so far from work. And I wondered what your thoughts might be around the future of location as opposed to city centre. You were talking about city centre and people not transferring their economic activity to their home environment, which I totally agree. I mean, things are delivered, we stay at home, we don't tend to go out and about very much. What about actually trying to live and work closer in locality, and that would really help in this kind of vision of being more integrated into our localities and being more active members of the community in many ways, with the workplace being part of that.
I think it's a lovely idea if we can do that. I think there's a certain sort of romanticism to sort of local living, local environments, local workplaces, but people still need to work in teams. Those teams need to work with other teams. The reason that those of us that have sort of managed corporate portfolios have been consolidating those portfolios like forever. I don't think I've ever, I spent 25 of my 30 years in sort of managing corporate portfolios, and consolidation was always an objective in some degree or other in just about every one of those organizations. To be managing less properties, to make them more centrally located, to widen the talent pool when the talent pool needed to actually physically commute to the office. Now that we don't need to do that, we've almost got more of a problem in the sense of, if we do want to bring people together and they are more physically dispersed, where do we do that? So the old sort of, I've noticed the sort of the trundling out of the old hub and spokes model that sort of real estate teams often look at. It's fantastic having a hub and spokes if your spokes are actually in the right place and people can get to the spokes, which is actually more difficult usually because most urban transport infrastructure is designed as a hub and spoke as well. And actually, what's quite interesting if you look at London's transport infrastructure is it's really damn difficult to get around London, and it's very easy to get into London. And actually, there is a diversity impact of that as well, which is sort of historically, that sort of hub and spokes has actually served the purposes of men and has the most. And what used to happen was the responsibilities of women when they weren't always in that workplace, and I'm talking a few decades ago when these were all sort of designed and put together, their journeys were more likely to be more local, but they were less likely to be hub and spokes, and they were more likely to be across town rather than into town when they're looking at retail, when they're looking at taking kids and collecting kids from school, that sort of thing. So those types of activities are very different patterns and very different transport needs. which is why I suggested that this is still a whole system problem as it relates to transport as well. Because actually one of the fascinating things in London, and I know there's people from a lot of locations on this meeting who aren't from London, but the opening of Crossrail is going to be fascinating to see how that changes our patterns of movement in the city and changes the importance of certain locations. Because if it works anywhere near as well as we think and hope it might, the ability to move across London through key locations at that kind of speed and in that kind of comfort is going to radically transform the way that we move around London. So it's going to be a sort of fascinating social experiment, if you like. And I think there'll be a huge knock-on effect in terms of sort of where organisations site their workplaces and how those workplaces are accessed. For the likes of Canary Wharf, which I think a little while ago, some people were fearing didn't really have a place in all of this in the future. As to why would you go to Canary Wharf? You know, actually, relatively low-cost office accommodation at the moment of a very high quality. And if you're close to that Crossrail station, you're back in the West End in about 10, 12 minutes. Suddenly, Canary Wharf has a slightly different appeal than it perhaps had pre-Crossrail. So again, this is all about the whole system problem. We can't just look at workplace in isolation. So I think you're right to raise commute in that sense, in terms of sort of how we travel, where we travel to from. But we do still need to think in terms of that triple bottom line. The needs of people are not just individual needs. One of the things I've noticed actually that is becoming the most pressing challenge in organisations is it's not the individual need. We're actually getting quite good at satisfying that. We're quite good at satisfying, and teams are, at sort of getting themselves together and satisfying their own needs. The real challenge comes from teams who need to work with other teams. That's where the real problem lies, because those teams are not necessarily arranging that time to be in the same physical space as the other teams they work with. So we're gradually moving out in concentric circles from individual to team. The next challenge is how teams get together with other teams. We've got that hub and spokes environment. It's going to potentially present a real challenge in getting people together face to face for the times that they need it.
Great. I've got another 2 questions for you, please, Neil.
Sure.
The first one is from Yaku. He asks, how does the budget for a minimal viable workplace look? Percentage-wise, how much should one keep for the post-move-in development of a project?
It's a good question. I'm not sure the second part of the question fits with the first part of the question. What I'm talking about here is, rather than just holding a bit back, I'm talking about an entirely different view of the way that we address the workplace in terms of the work we do within it, the space we create, and how we continue to spend that money. It's not just a case of, from time to time, if an organisation relocates, leases up, there's an event of some sort, it will have an obligation to do some degree of fit out on a new space, just to make it work for that organisation, for its particular needs. But thereafter, I'm talking about a progressive spend, not spend 90%, hold 10% back, but I'm talking about spend 10%, 10%, 10% as we go, because it won't necessarily be the whole organisation that will change. It will be small parts of the organisation that changes. It'll be certain functions. It'll be a reaction to the marketplace that organisation exists in, or changes in society that change the way the organisation needs to work. And so there will be a progressive expenditure. I see, fit out becoming a progressive activity rather than a one-off activity and a one-time event. There will still be those one-time events. They will be smaller, but we'll be looking at this over a long period of time, not just a short period of time. Which in effect means that, potentially it's of greater benefit to the industry. Because realistically, you're creating longer-term relationships. They're much stickier relationships than, responding to an RFP, winning a job, completing the job, and walking away again. So I'm rather hoping that actually it benefits the industry, and the industry thrives, because for those organisations needing to procure these services, that's a benefit too. But if we think about the music industry, this is potentially a sort of a bit of a Napster moment for the workplace industry, which is, the music industry, although it killed off Napster when it first came into being, effectively it changed the whole nature of the way that music was sold. much more very small items that were sold rather than larger units. And when I say large units, I mean sort of compact discs, vinyl, cassettes. Instead of selling things for sort of 12 to 15 pounds at a time, it's now selling very small sort of online downloads, plays, subscriptions, those sorts of things. It took 15 years for the music industry to reinvent itself and to become profitable again post-Napster. But it had to do it because the challenge to the industry was so fundamental that it had to rethink the ways that it actually sold its products and it made its money. And to a degree, I think, for the whole of the workplace industry. I mean, that's the whole of the workplace industry, other than probably FM, which has much more of an ongoing responsibility for looking after physical space and looking after the needs of people outside of that physical space. It's the rest of the industry that needs to actually have a look at the way that it operates and think about a much more adaptable future rather than a one-time event-driven present.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we go back into the room, we've got one more quick question from Carrie, and she would like to know your thoughts on measuring the minimal viable workplace and your learnings and successes. She wants to know what new tech, metrics, and/or mechanics are needed to collect unbiased data on the minimal viable workplace performance.
Well, I haven't pitched the tech that we've created, but of course you've beautifully segued into suggesting that GoSpace AI is probably the solution you need. But what we do actually need is we need an understanding of how that space is being used in a real-time basis. This isn't in the same way that the workplace industry will need to change from being sort of event-driven. If you think about the sort of way we collected data and the way we measured our workplaces pre-COVID, they were very much geared around one-time events. The 1 or 2 week utilization study, the one-time satisfaction survey, series of interviews. We'd wrap it all up in a strategy report. Bang, there you go. Right, now let's design and build something and spend a lot of money on the back of that fairly minimal data collection. Actually, what we need is we need to understand how people are using space, how they need to use space, what's going on in that space, but not just as a one-time event. We need to understand this on an ongoing basis, and we need a much richer picture. So I think our industry actually has a little bit of a data problem right now, which is the old data that we used to collect is no longer relevant. It's no longer valid, even today, let alone before we start getting into creating the minimum viable workplace as a sort of beneficial contribution. You know, we really do have to think as an industry what data it is that we need, and we also then need to understand how we generate insight from that data, because it's all very well having a big heap of data. If we can't make sense of it, it's completely pointless, which means fundamentally, right at the beginning of that process, we have to work out what questions it is we want to ask. It's pointless just collecting data. We haven't asked the right question. So I think, you know, the questions, the data, the insight, and then from there, what solutions do we want to put in place? There are various stages of data that we need to go through to make sure that we're able to respond to the needs of organizations from here.
Thank you very much, Neil. Mark, if you can just check if there's one more question.
Any more questions at all in the room?
Thank you. I was just wondering about your books and who they're aimed at. The reason I ask is that I recently left the company and I recognize so many of the more characteristics from them and literally none of the less characteristics. And now, not just from attending this seminar, but having done some sort of analysis, maybe even subconsciously, that it was because of that I left that company. So I was wondering if I was to pick up your books, are they going to add to my interest, or are they aimed at more people who are looking to implement this in a sort of workplace?
Well, I hope you'd be interested in them. No, don't bother with my books. They're absolutely rubbish. Probably wouldn't say that. But the Elemental Workplace was originally called through, there was a series of blog posts where the idea sort of came together and I could sort of track it over the space of a couple of years. But the first presentation I ever did on it was called the Minimum Wage Workplace. Because the idea was, when I first sat down at the kitchen table to think, well, what is it that actually we need to do that is the barest minimum but has the maximum effect? Because it's all very well being a huge tech company with billions to spend on the workplace, but most organizations are not in that position. You know, they're sort of scraping around, trying to bring these budgets together to do something. They know they need to respond with their workplace. So what I was thinking was, well, what do we absolutely fundamentally need to do to create the biggest possible impact, which is why it became the elemental workplace, because I came up with 12 areas that we need to focus on, with the suggestion that if we get those right, you might not win any design awards or industry awards for creating beautiful, fantastic, sort of, sweeping great workplaces, but you'll actually be meeting the needs of the people who work in that space. And you'll actually be responding to what it is the organisation needs, and you'll be responsible and inclusive and all of those sorts of things as well. So the whole gist of that was actually, it's not about providing sort of luxury. It wasn't about providing something incredible. It was about just basically doing as much as we possibly can with as little as possible to have that maximum effect. So in that sense, and I've tested it a few times thinking, because obviously I thought with COVID, I thought, does this pull the rug from underneath my sort of work, really? And is it still relevant? I've sort of objectively tested it. I think it is still relevant. The second book about change isn't necessarily a workplace book. It's about leading change in any sector. It will apply to the workplace, but it's a toolkit based on the same elemental approach, which is what is it you actually need to do, understanding change, understanding how we deliver it and what we have to do to make change successful. So in that sense, you're welcome to have them, and let me know what you think.
Thank you very much for that. On that note, we are going to finish. We've just put a little link in the chat. If you're interested in these talks and you want to know more, feel free to click on that mkinsightgroup.com/events. We've got many more events coming up. If you could do us a quick thank you, please just write a thank you to Neil if you'd like to. Neil, you'll probably see on your laptop a few things coming up. And then after this, as we finish, you'll be taken away to another website where you can actually review Neil, and feel free to be as honest as you'd like to be. And on that note, I would like to thank you very, very much. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Thanks very much.